We run these SEG Women's Network Committee webinars once a month on average, and the idea is to highlight a female in the geophysics profession, and in this section we're honored to have Sarah Morton Rupert, who is an engineering geophysicist with over 10 years of experience in applied geophysics research for engineering and geohazards related projects. She's worked at the USGS, the Connecticut Geological Survey, the National Center for Research on Earthquake Engineering in Taiwan, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the Kansas Geological Survey. Just last year, she joined the U.S. Bureau of Rec as a geophysicist at their Technical Service Center out in Denver, Colorado. And she is here today to talk to us about seismic surface waves to interpret subsidence features and cavern roof failure stages.
All right. So yes, thank you again, Roxy and Blair, for inviting me to speak to y'all today. So at the top is this. I really like to take a lot of field photos, and so I'm going to be talking about a time-lapse study that I worked on for my PhD, and the top is just the same grain elevator that I worked outside of from over the course of at least 5 years. So this is a different sunrise with every single time I was out there collecting data. So again, my talk today is characterizing a physical model of a collapsing void. Oh, I think this is different from the title I gave you. It's the same talk, I guarantee you. But we're going to be looking at some subsidence features that we were able to identify using surface wave analysis. So it's like where it's a door that opens, and so the trapdoor serves as a void roof, if you will. And so this vertical structure you see is the soil arching in effect. And so we can use that to interpret different types of shear surfaces or failure planes. And as you can see, the structure gets taller, which is that vertical progression I was talking about before. So these are some of the sort of features I'm interested in for trying to better understand the development of these failure surfaces and how those can be observed in real time, if you will, and then use those to identify what sort of failure stages or what sort of state of stress the material is in to help us understand the risk of failure. So my trapdoor experiment that I set up, this is a really fun little picture I drew for you. So I have a little trapdoor down here that is powered or held up by an electrical jack. On the sides are two wooden stationary supports. So they act as the side walls of the void with the airspace where the jack is. That is what we're going to refer to as the void itself. And above that, I laid out 7 layers of Kansas river sand. I'm about 10 centimeters tall. The material was compacted every 10 centimeters. And then on the top, I deployed a receiver spread of 23 100 hertz vertical geophones because we wanted a higher frequency phone because this is going to be very high frequency information we're looking at. And the spacing was 8 centimeters because that is as close as I could possibly put the geophones without touching each other. And I used 23 geophones because that's how many I could fit into this box. The box itself is about 1.5 meters wide and about 1 meter tall, but we only used about 72 centimeters of total fill. So here's an actual picture of the sandbox. So down here at the bottom, you see that red electrical jack. This aqua colored thing is actually holding up one of the displacement transducers. And so we had 2 deployed, one on an opposite corner. And so that actually helped me determine how much the trapdoor was moving. And I controlled the downward movement of that trapdoor. And then you see these black lines in the sand, which is just black dyed sand to help us better observe any sort of changes in the soil structure. Because what we did was I slowly moved the trapdoor vertically downwards to simulate a collapsing roof structure as it would normally. Obviously not this simplified in the real world, but this is a common type of test that is done in the geotechnical field for looking at soil arching. So I used it for trying to simulate a void failure here. And if you're interested in any of the material properties, they're listed here down at the bottom. Please excuse my dog barking. And so, yeah, let's just jump into how we looked at data here. So as you can see on the left, I'm compacting the data with just a little weight drop. So every layer was compacted as uniformly as possible. So I had the same number of impacts to compact it. Here in the center is the geophone spread. You can see all the phones. And then what's the most fun is that we used an active source to collect this data. And the active source was actually a 9/16 inch wrench. So very high frequency. We're looking at, I had this cute little metal plate that my machine shop cut out for me. And then here's just another picture of that displacement transducer. So this top part, this needle point you see here, basically just moves up and down. For my work, hopefully just moved downwards. So it measured the total change in this vertical downward displacement of the trapdoor in 2 corners. So we collected both active source data. So you can see here on the left is my classmate using the tiny little wrench to create a vertical impact on the sand surface. And then on the right is me taking pictures. So we took pictures every time we moved the trapdoor downwards. And I'll talk to you next about how often and when we did that in a little bit. But first, a little bit about the surface wave method. So if you're not familiar, the surface wave method, which is commonly associated with the multi-channel analysis of surface waves, or MASW, is regarded as a non-invasive rapid acquisition method. A lot of people like it because it's really quick to deploy. You can retrieve data fairly quickly. It's inexpensive. The equipment itself is inexpensive, and the data processing doesn't take too long if you know what you're doing. And this is all relative to drilling. So almost anything is cheaper than drilling, right? So we all know that geophysics offers a less expensive alternative to that, or at least something to supplement our drilling for making better informed decisions. And again, you see this equation here where shear wave velocity is related to the shear modulus of density. And fortunately, we believe we can use shear wave velocity to get an indication of material stiffness due to that relationship with shear modulus. In just a couple applications of the surface wave method, estimating depth of bedrock, faults, fractures. Some people use it for better understanding levees. So that's because of that shear modulus. We're looking at changes in the shear modulus or the changes in the stiffness of the material, and other types of void studies like I'm going to be talking about today. So here's the equipment that I used. This picture is not from the lab experiment. It's from the fieldwork component that we'll get into later. But if you're unfamiliar for any reason, you've got a geode, which is essentially your seismograph. You've got a battery to power the geode. You got to have your geophones, which is this little yellow thing here. And the geophones all connect to what's called a takeout cable, which is this red cable, which then talks to the geode itself. So real quick, the MASW method, or the multi-channel analysis of surface waves, again, can be summarized in 3 steps. So if you're talking about active MASW, the first step is to just collect the data. So you use some sort of impact source like a hammer. I've really simply drawn here. You impact the ground with the hammer, and it generates seismic waves, and we can measure the velocity of those waves with the receiver array like we showed earlier. Then you apply a fast Fourier transform to then create this image, something like this image here, which is called a dispersion curve image. And a dispersion curve shows the relationship between phase velocity and frequency. So it's basically a pictorial representation of a propagating surface wave. And then we can invert this dispersion curve to create a velocity profile. So that's going to be shear wave velocity versus depth. And if you have multiple profiles like this, you can combine them to create a pseudo 2D section with velocity versus depth again. So this is a pretty common application, at least in the near surface field, also in my engineering geophysics field as well. So here's an example of the raw data that we collected in our sandbox. So you can see the raw seismic traces. You've got some higher amplitudes here. You've got some nice first arrivals. And then this image on the right is the dispersion curve corresponding to that raw data. So you've got a pretty high amplitude dispersion curve you can interpret here in a very high frequency range. So we're looking at about 100 to 155 hertz, which at least for me is is much higher frequency than I normally work in. I think a lot of people who do MASW probably more frequently work in the 10 to 30 hertz range. So this was a little fun to change my frequency range of interest here. And then here is the results of the sandbox test. So what I did was I descended that trapdoor vertically downwards in 1 millimeter increments, actually. And every 1 millimeter, I took a picture of the sandbox, and every 7 millimeters, I did a surface wave survey. So this 0 millimeters one you see all the way to the left is what we're going to call the baseline conditions. The 150 is actually 150 meters per second. So also pretty low frequency because this is mostly unconsolidated sand. So you're going to be looking at pretty low frequency, or I'm sorry, low velocity information. So in general, you see a pretty laterally layered environment where velocity increases with depth. I would like to point out that you probably see this white color and then this higher velocity layer towards the top of each image. And I should have just grayed this out for you, but I'm going to be focusing on the 0.25 to 0.75 meter depth range for the remainder of this talk. Everything in the upper 25, there were some inversion artifacts that were just, there's just limitations of the surface wave method where, nothing's perfect. So we weren't able to get really good resolution of this upper layer, and everything of interest is going to be in that 0.25 to 0.75 meter range. So after moving the trapdoor downwards 7 millimeters, so this black box represents the placement of that trapdoor at the bottom of the box. After 7 millimeters of movement, we see a change in the velocity structure. So the right side that I'm circling actually stays kind of the same as it did before, but you'll notice that on the left side of the trapdoor, you actually see a drop in shear wave velocity. So this 150 millimeter contour hopefully helps guide your eye to see these changes. So again, we see a drop in shear wave velocity on the left side. As we continue to move the trapdoor downwards, we see what's interesting now. We almost see a dome-like structure that extends across the entire trapdoor, which is very interesting. So you see a drop in shear wave velocity on the edge of each trapdoor here, and then you start to see some increases immediately above the trapdoor. Continuing to move the trapdoor downwards again, we relative to this third image, we still see some increased velocity above the trapdoor on the left side, but we see relatively slightly decreased velocity on the right side, so an uneven distribution of velocity across the trapdoor. Moving vertically downwards another 7 millimeters of the trapdoor. Now we don't really see a dome structure, but we do see high velocity at the corners themselves, just the corners, which is very interesting. And then finally, as we move another final 7 millimeters vertically downwards, we start to see that dome-like structure again that is about the lateral extent of the trapdoor, but the overall velocity of this dome-like feature you see has an overall decreased velocity relative to what we saw in this 14. So in the 14, you start to see a lot of these red colors, whereas in the 35 millimeter image, it's mostly yellow and green. So similar in terms of the velocity contours, but the average velocity is overall lower, which is very interesting. So here are the pictures that I took that correspond to each of those velocity images I just showed you. So this first one is there's no displacement, nothing has happened, everything is pretty lateral. As we move into this 7 millimeter displacement, I mean, honestly, looking at this image, it still kind of looks the same. It's probably too hard to tell if any movement has happened. But as you move into this 14 millimeters, hopefully you can see that that bluish line is actually now dropping below that horizontal dashed line that I've overlaid for you as like a reference. So at least these first two, or these bottom two lines, you start to see these bluish purple lines dropping. It becomes more apparent in the 21 millimeter image. You can actually start to see it starting to bow downwards. And you can actually start to see it start to go all the way up towards this, the second to top line. And then it becomes more obvious in the 28 millimeters and then again in the 35. So the material appears to be dropping downwards, which you would expect because the trapdoor is moving downwards, right? So hopefully you can see also at the bottom, this line right here is actually the trapdoor. So you can see it descending with each one, with the soil also following it. So what I've done for you here is I've actually started to connect all of these different changes we see. And at the end, it creates a dome-like structure, which is like the tension dome we saw earlier in this presentation. So, which is what we were hoping and what we expected. What's particularly interesting about this is that we actually have what look to be two different dome-like structures. There's this larger, taller outer dome, and then this inner dome. And then these yellow lines I've drawn for you are what I've interpreted as normal faulting, whereas the black lines is reverse faulting. So this is consistent with the literature in terms of the development, like sinkhole development and such like that, where first you have this reverse faulting because you have the material moving downwards relative to the other stuff. But then once the overall structure starts to relax, which is when you start to have some sort of, you can start to have some sort of surface expression. So I don't think you can really see it in these pictures, but maybe you can. Right at this tippy top, the sand has actually slightly dropped, and that's what starts to create that bowl structure we're actually probably more familiar with, where you get these like depressions in the ground. So that is due to this normal faulting that is developed here. So if we compare to the seismic data that I collected, I've taken these black lines I drew for you on the pictures and I overlaid them onto the seismic images. And interestingly enough, we actually start to see some similarities in the structure between the interpreted photos as well as the structure of the shear wave velocity, which is quite fun. So unfortunately, again, we can only really pay attention to the 0.25 to 0.75 depth range. But what I found to be quite interesting, like I mentioned, is that these oblique lines I've drawn from you as interpreted from the images actually correlate pretty well to the changes in, at least where the changes in velocity happen. So we expect them to originate from the corners and then they actually progress all the way upwards, and they align pretty nicely with those changes in velocity. So what does all this mean? Now, we believe that these changes in shear wave velocity, so the changes I'm showing you here, where you have these decreases and increases in velocity as you move the trapdoor downwards, we believe that those are consistent with the development of failure features above the void or the trapdoor. And I believe that is also consistent with the images that we saw. And what's fun is that the spatial distribution of these velocity variations corresponds to the progressive development of these failure features, which again, this seems to be consistent with, where these changes in velocity seem to appear where there are failure features developing and then progressing vertically upwards. So like we just saw, these photographs seem to confirm the development and the location of these failure features. And based on these observations, we believe that the velocity variations are indicators of changes in the stress field conditions and therefore can be used as indicators of the void roof collapse. Now, if we take what we've learned and apply it to field data that we collected at that site in Hutchinson that I mentioned, again, as a reminder, this site has some abandoned salt dissolution production wells. So I've drawn that here in the center. So each profile is centered on this one well that I'm going to be talking about, well 2A. And so in 2013 is when we started collecting some passive shear wave data. And while it's not the focus of this talk, but we use those nearby trains I mentioned earlier actually as our passive seismic source, because we needed to achieve a lot of depth at this area in particular, because if you remember, the depth to salt was about 80 meters, which is quite hard to achieve with just an active source. So we used passive seismic data, or passive seismic sources. So in this first year, 2013, we identified this as a baseline study. So you see a pretty lateral structure in terms of velocity, with velocity increasing in depth. As you move on to 2014, we interestingly saw a pretty, what I believe to be a drastic change in the velocity structure. So you actually see a low shear wave velocity anomaly where consistent with the location of this dissolution well that you see here. And then as you move into 15, we still have that low velocity feature right where the well is drilled. And we have increased velocity on the sides. As we move into 17, that low velocity feature we saw in 14 and 15 is gone, but we actually see an overall decrease in velocity relative to at least 13 and the sidewalls themselves in 14 and 15. So it's a more, you can almost argue a more uniform or lateral distribution, but it's lower than what we saw in previous years. As we move into 18, you see that same almost lateral distribution of velocity around the well, but it is now the velocity is now slightly higher, at least than the 2017. Now, how can we relate this back to the laboratory study? Well, we have our baseline data. So this top row is going to be the sandbox study we just talked about. The bottom row is the field data. So for obvious reasons, the first two images are the baseline. So we suspect that to be representative of the environment before any sort of failure, before any sort of void collapse has happened. Just so you know, this borehole is plugged, so we are unable to get into it. So we only have the geologic information that was pulled from it, and which reports that the void is present. We were unable to retrieve any other information about the subsurface, at least in situ wise, about the subsurface throughout the duration of the study. So for all intents and purposes, these first two images are just going to be the baseline. We're saying no movement. As we move into the next stage, so I've actually coupled these 4 different images from the laboratory study with the 14 and 15 images from the field study. And what I believe is that there is this change in distribution of load on the void, which is what we believe has been happening in the 7 millimeters to 28 millimeters. So in the 7 millimeters, we saw a decrease on the left side versus a normal state of velocity, if you will, on the right side, then increases, then another change where one corner saw a decrease versus the other corner, and then we saw slight increases on both corners. This seems consistent with some sort of changes we saw in 14 and 15, where the distribution of load on the void was all changing over time. As we move into these last images, so the 35 millimeters, where we saw this dome-like feature come out again, but the overall velocity was slightly lower than the initial values, we believe are representative of what we saw in 17 and 18. And what we believe happened between these two stages. So more specifically, what we believe happened between 15 and 17 is we believe that a actual failure occurred between 15 and 17. So you saw this uneven distribution of load and change in load in 14 and 15. And then to get to 17, you see a more evenly distribution of velocity across, which to me indicates that for example, a layer of the roof that we saw, or a layer of the roof may have failed. So for instance, maybe the lowest layer of the roof failed, which once you get rid of that weakest component, then you can have a more even distribution of stress or a more even distribution of velocity across the void, which would be indicative, or which would be consistent with what we see here in this velocity structure, both of these velocity structures. And so that is what we believe has happened with this 35 millimeters as well, because at this point, we actually saw the tension dome, or we saw those failure features actually make it to the surface. And we also started to see the development of the normal faulting, which implies there is some sort of relaxation going on with the structure. And relaxation happens after a failure event. So if you recall, we talked about this earlier today, where you might have multiple voids that preferentially grow laterally to develop a larger void. As this void gets too wide, the roof structure is no longer able to live under its own self-weight, and it collapses. We believe potentially something similar may have happened, where the loading on the void changed over time in the field example. So to give some more context here, so the upper 20 meters was this the Pleistocene beds, and then the shale goes from about 30 down to 60. One thing that's important to note is that this low velocity feature you see here, you may have wondered, oh, is that the void? Is that the salt jug, as it's called? Is that the dissolution void? And no, the void itself is actually much deeper. So it is below 80 meters, like I mentioned earlier. And what we believe this low velocity feature is showing is it's just a representation of what is happening deeper down in the subsurface. And so that this change in low velocity, or this low velocity feature you're seeing, we believe is indicative of that change in load, or that change in distribution of load on the void itself. So superimpose these fun images for you guys here from before. So in 14, you may see the salt jug is there, and it has a tension dome developing. Potentially in 15, some of that material may have collapsed, or maybe it's about to collapse. And then in 17, you start to see because that collapse has happened, the loading on the void itself is more evenly distributed. So we don't necessarily have this tension dome structure anymore. And so it's now able to exist under its own self-weight, and hopefully not further collapse, because if it did further collapse, we would have seen it at the surface. But fortunately, that has not happened for us here at this specific borehole location. So in conclusion, we observed velocity variations in the time-lapse shear-wave velocity sections, both in the trapdoor or the physical model I showed you, and we believe these changes in velocity are associated with a load transfer phenomenon above the trapdoor. The load transfer happened because we moved the trapdoor vertically downwards, so we changed the distribution of load and induced soil arching. That soil arching appeared to create, was able to be observed as changes in velocity. And we were able to not only see these changes in velocity, but we were able to see in real time the development of shear planes or failure planes, which we then correlated to each other. And based on these laboratory observations, we believe that we can indeed use shear wave velocity as an indicator of stress, related to the collapse or failure of a void structure. And this topic has been discussed in the literature, but it's, to the best of my knowledge, it's actually not been shown or exemplified in any sort of laboratory experiment in real time. So we have observed changes in shear wave velocity, and we've believed they were related to changes in stress. But again, to the best of my knowledge, nobody has actually published a study where they investigated this and saw those correlations happen in real time. And so fortunately, these changes or these velocity variations we saw related to the development of failure planes in my sandbox, we then brought over to the field example, which we believe also support our initial claims that we believe some sort of localized failure event happened between 15 and 17 that then allowed the structure to become basically better balanced in the subsurface. However, this is just one cycle of collapse that's potentially been observed. And also this cycle of collapse that I talked about in the field is also what I believe is the first field study that's actually shown this progression in change of velocity over time related to a failure event. So there's a lot of what I believe are firsts in the study, which is pretty exciting. And so we, although I'm no longer at the Kansas Geological Survey, they can plan to continue doing these efforts. And this research can be actually applied to several different areas that have voids. And hopefully we can further develop this research to get a better understanding of what's going on in the subsurface and create better informed decisions about failure stages and collapse, and hopefully mitigate any sort of failures that could affect populations and communities at the surface. So here's some fun photos from my laboratory experiment. I'd like to thank you all for being here today with me. I'm pretty humbled to be here and invited to give this talk. I have a lot of institutions that supported my work while I was there. I'm wearing a jacket in the lab because it was January and it's really cold in Kansas. And I'd also like to thank the SEG community because I actually presented a variation of this talk at the SEG 2020 virtual conference and was selected as one of the top 25 best papers at that conference. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
I like the pictures.
I know.
So I do have some questions coming into the Q&A here that I'll repeat for you. Thank you very much for presenting your very interesting work. Can the effect of changing shear velocity somehow also be observed in the dispersion curves? And do these also change with time/trapdoor opening?
That's a great question. So I don't mean to like plug my own work here, but I can refer you to my paper in the leading edge that actually plots dispersion curves from the study that I showed here. And it actually shows those changes in the phase velocities with each year. So you can actually see the shape of the dispersion curve. You can see the phase velocities going downwards and then recovering back upwards. So yes, we did also observe, which you would hope, right? Because otherwise you'd have less confidence in the data. So fortunately, we did see changes in phase velocity that were then related to these changes in shear wave velocity. And I'm pretty sure we saw similar events with the trapdoor data. I just don't have a study to reference to you because it's under review. And we all know how long that takes. So.
Yes, as a reviewer and an associate editor, I do know how long that takes. Thank you. From Amanda, did you only perform the one set of tests in the sandbox?
Is this my good friend, Amanda?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Amanda. Hey, Amanda. No, I actually conducted 4 sandbox tests. I only talk about one of them here, and just because it was beautiful and it's a lot of data to talk about in one study. But I can tell you that we saw similar results in at least in the different tests that we conducted. And for your own personal curiosity, so some of the changes we did from test to test were actually, you can kind of see it here in this picture. you can see how there's actually a gap in the sand. So what we did was we actually used a geotextile that we laid across the trapdoor. And we used that to try to simulate the like bowing effect that happens, because obviously the roof isn't just going to have like a block slowly move downwards. So we used that textile to simulate the bowing effect. So hopefully that answers your question. Yes.
I have two in here, so I'm going to start with one at a time. Do you think you could distinguish between a water saturated layer about to collapse and a cavity already collapsed using only active surface waves?
This is a great question. So water tends to complicate everything. However, because we are talking about surface waves, I guess I need to ask for a refinement of your question. Are you suggesting that the entire environment is saturated? Or are you asking if you can differentiate between like a saturated and unsaturated change? We did work only in a dry environment because it was easier, first of all. But theoretically, if it's saturated, there should be probably some more cohesion. So there should be, so I think you would still probably be able to see changes. You probably wouldn't know from the seismic data, from the surface wave data, that it's saturated because it's shear wave velocity, and shear wave velocity cannot provide you information about water saturation because water is not rigid. It has no shear modulus. So I'm not sure that answers your question. But
let us know in the chat box but there's another one on here too. Have you already tested estimates of continuous velocity variation by cross correlation of ambient noise? It could be an attractive complementary study to these interesting experiments.
I think I need to read that question. Okay.
I was like, can you see them? That would help.
I can see the question. Sorry, reading is hard. So I have not done any work in saturated, to answer your questions. And you tested, I have not cross-correlated my data. So the field data that I showed you is using the a type of passive MASW method that is essentially the conventional phase shift method. So there's no cross correlation going on, and that is not a method I chose for processing the data. So the answer is no, I guess. I haven't done any cross correlation, but it would be interesting to compare it. The method that we did use for collecting the data is called the 1D, 2D passive MASW method, and you can find it in Geophysics 2021.
So Gozi here has a question. How can we link this surface wave with geotechnical? And just to clarify that, do you mean, what are applications of using surface waves with geotechnical research?
So I think I can answer this question without the clarification. But so great question, because engineers ask me this all the time. And so for surface wave data, at least in my experience, geotechnical engineers tend to be interested in the velocity contours. And in some cases, we have some borehole data, which has density information, and we can use our shear wave velocity with those in situ density measurements to then basically translate the velocities into shear modulus. And then the geotechnical engineers can use these shear modulus profiles, if you will, to better understand the different material, the material environment. So the surface wave method is actually pretty common, I've found, in the geotechnical field. And a lot of engineers that I've worked with, at least, have a pretty good understanding of shear wave velocity, at least how to use that shear wave velocity information. I did not, I see there's another question, so hopefully I answered Gozi's question. Let's
put in here that we answered these.
Yeah.
So from Kevin, did you test it with a grain size contrast?
So I used in the sandbox the same type of sand for like a very simple case. So the only thing that probably changed is maybe the degree of compaction, just due to the adding more material on top of it. So the degree of compaction probably changed from top to bottom of the box, but no, I use only one type of Kansas River sand material.
Sarah, I don't think they have, I'm very familiar with trying to pack sand in a box. So I can't imagine using something else. Love this. What steps did you take to process your data?
So I'm not sure I understand the data, but to reiterate, so I processed all of the surface wave data using the MASW method, the multi-channel analysis of surface waves. So that is where I used the dispersion curve information that I retrieved from the raw data, and I picked my dispersion curves and then inverted them using the algorithm by Shaw et al. In 1999 to create the velocity profiles. And then because I had multiple velocity profiles across my sandbox, I was able to combine them to create those pseudo 2D velocity images that I showed you before.
Any other questions from the group? Sarah, since I missed the first 20 minutes because I was driving, sorry. Did you get to tell them what you are doing now?
I have not talked about my job.
Yeah, I'd love it if you just to give them a 1 minute synopsis of what you've taken this work and translated it into, to give them an idea.
Sure. So I guess for background, like Blair is demanding from me, so I actually did this work through a geotechnical engineering department at the University of Kansas. And so that was very fun. And fortunately, my work here was able to help me get a position as a geophysicist with the Bureau of Reclamation. And for those not familiar, the Bureau of Reclamation is a federal agency within the Department of the Interior, and their motto is managing water of the West. So if you're familiar with the Hoover Dam or Grand Coulee, for example, those are all dams within the Bureau of Reclamation's inventory. So we, as the Bureau, have over 500 dams in the West. And as a geophysicist, it's actually my job to use different geophysical methods to basically monitor the health of these dams and try to solve different structures. And if you live in the US, or maybe you don't, you're probably very aware of how great our infrastructure is here, and how you might have also heard about the infrastructure bill that just passed recently, the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And so a lot of that money is going to be used to help not only repair highways, but also help repair a lot of our dams and levees and other sort of canal systems in the United States to help bring water to different communities across the Western United States.
It's pretty cool stuff, and she used to use about pretty much every type of geophysical equipment out there, which is pretty fun. So
yep,
it's a thought for future careers.
Yeah, and so I get to work with engineers just about every day, work with geologists, and together we all put our heads together to try to figure out the best way and the most cost-effective way to repair our dams. And so by repair, I mean maybe there's some seepage that's not supposed to be there. So I help try to find where that seepage is. And or if there is a fault nearby, I try to help image or determine where that fault is. Recently, I did a work where apparently I didn't know this, maybe you guys did, but back in the day, we liked to build our dams on landslides because it was convenient. So I had to try to map the vertical extent of the, oh, look, you can see my coworkers talking to us. I'll tell her, she's famous now. Yeah, we got to map the landslides themselves. I was just in Puerto Rico trying to help them map bedrock and better understand what some of the material properties are of the environment around these dams. So not only do I work on reclamation dams, but I assist as a federal agency, we assist any other federal group or group that owns a dam in the United States to help them solve problems that they're encountering.
Well, this was super awesome. Thank you so much for this. Roxy's gonna have to jump into another meeting, which is gonna cut off the webinar, so I was trying to do that. But just so you all know, we are taking off June and July, but then our series is gonna resume again in August. And thank you so much again, Sarah, for your presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all for being here.